Hi everyone, tonight we're going to sit with a woman whose garden gloves still have soil under the nails and whose children are about to break her heart with smiles on their faces. You might think growing up means growing wiser, but you'd be amazed how often adulthood just means better excuses. So before you feel like you've got a handle on family, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Also drop a comment with your location and the local time you're tuning in. I love seeing how far this story travels. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. A. The roses were doing surprisingly well for early spring. I was elbow deep in mulch, humming along to some Glenn Campbell, drifting from the porch radio, when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A silver convertible rounded the bend in my driveway, followed by a sleek black pickup, and finally a too shiny white Lexus SUV. For a second, I thought someone had taken a wrong turn into my sleepy corner of Vermont. Then I recognized the plates. My heart did a small skip. All three of them, Sarah, Connor, and Elise, here together. That hadn't happened well, since my last surgery when they took turns nodding politely and checking their phones in the hospital lobby. Mom, Sarah, called climbing out of her car like she had somewhere more important to be in 10 minutes. We need to talk. A lesser person might have panicked. I, however, simply snipped off one more faded bloom and wiped my hands on my apron. I'd learned somewhere in my 70s that most talks from adult children come wrapped in productivity buzzwords and end with someone else's agenda. We made our way into the living room, the one with the lopsided bookshelf Connor built in middle school, and the quilt Elise spilled grape juice on when she was 6. I sat in my favorite chair, still warm from the afternoon sun. Sarah, the 51-year-old attorney with a perpetual Bluetooth headset around her neck, crossed her legs like she was about to depose a hostile witness. "We've been talking," she said, "and we're concerned about your living situation." I blinked. My living situation. Connor, 48, who ran a network of car dealerships across 3 states, leaned forward. "Mum, you're alone out here. What if you fall? What if there's an emergency and none of us can get here in time?" Elise the baby, at 44, certified financial planner and walking podcast summary, nodded and said, "We all live hours away. You don't even have a medical alert system." I held up my wrist. "This is an Apple Watch. I fell last winter, and it tried to call 911 and play me meditation music at the same time." They didn't laugh. Sarah produced a brochure from her expensive tote bag. I knew it was expensive because it still had the little designer tag dangling off the handle like a trophy. "Sunny Ridge," she announced, "an assisted living community just outside Montpelier. It's gorgeous. Your own apartment, communal activities, on-site medical team. Mum, you'd love it." I looked at the brochure and then at my children, and I saw it what people call the pivot. That invisible moment when you go from being a person they love to a liability they manage. It felt like the universe had handed them the grown-up clipboard, and my name was the next checkbox. "Your father and I built this house together," I said, folding the brochure slowly. "I've lived here for over 4 decades." Connor cleared his throat. "And it's been a beautiful home. But, time passes." "Exactly," Elise said, always eager to drive the final nail. "And real estate's hot right now. If we list soon, we can use the money to help cover Sunny Ridge." "It just makes sense, Mom." I could feel the corners of my mouth twitch. It wasn't a smile. Not really. "Has anyone asked what I want?" They blinked. The kind of blink you do when you realize your GPS might be wrong, but you're already late to dinner. "We just want what's best for you," Sarah said softly. I nodded, folded the brochure again, and set it down beside my gardening gloves. "Then let's do what's best," I said. And just like that, I gave in. Or so they thought. Because here's the thing about being 73, you've survived long enough to know when you're being managed. And you've earned the right to plan your own damn escape. They gave me 2 suitcases and 3 boxes. That's what my life was reduced to. 2 battered Samsonites that still smelled faintly of cedar from the attic, and 3 cardboard boxes, hastily labeled by Elise in permanent marker, kitchen, books, misc. I watched from my recliner, still my recliner for the moment, as Sarah supervised a team of college-aged movers who treated my furniture like oversized IKEA. One of them knocked over the ceramic vase I'd received from my neighbor Dorothy the year her husband died. It cracked. He shrugged. "This can come with you," Elise said cheerily, holding up a photo of me and their father on the day we closed on this house, my cheeks sunburned from planting the dogwoods out front. "This'll have to go," she added, tapping the upright piano my husband restored from a thrift store in 1982. The same one I'd played Edelweiss on every night for years before bed. I said nothing. My voice, it turns out, had packed itself away before the rest of me. Connor had hired the moving company. Big guys. Mismatched t-shirts. One wore a tank top that read, "No pain, no gain," which struck me as ironic given the way he mishandled my antique mirror and seemed to gain nothing from my quiet gasp. They didn't ask questions, just hauled memories by the armful and dropped them into a van like it was a trash compactor for nostalgia. Every time something left the house, a framed cross-stitch, a casserole dish I'd used every Christmas, I felt a pinch. Not quite pain, but something hollow and scraping. "Where's your china set?" Elise asked. I pointed toward the dining room cabinet, a family heirloom from my mother. Elise hesitated, as if debating whether chipped porcelain from 1964 was worth the bubble wrap. "Maybe we just keep a few pieces for display at Sunny Ridge," she muttered, mostly to herself. And just like that, it was decided. No one cried. Not even me. Not during the whirlwind of sorting, packing, measuring, or donating. I held it together with the same steely patience I had when my oldest brought home a D in algebra, or when the dog ate half a pumpkin pie in '89. But inside I was burning. That night, after the house went quiet, I walked room to room in my socks. The movers had left gouges in the hardwood. My hardwood. I knelt down to trace a familiar scuff near the hallway, Sarah's heel mark from prom night. It was still there, faded, but stubborn, like every other trace I'd preserved through decades of family. I stood in the kitchen, staring at the space where the kettle used to sit, listening to the faint hum of the empty fridge. Connor had unplugged it, already prepping it for resale. I could hear Elise's voice from earlier in the day. "You'll have your own kitchenette at Sunny Ridge, Mom. You can make tea any time." Right. Because steeping a Lipton in a microwave-safe mug next to a mini-fridge and a vinyl couch is exactly the same. The next morning, I found Sarah in the hallway with her phone pressed to her ear and a clipboard in her other hand. She was finalizing some legal transfer or power of attorney I didn't ask. She was in full executive mode. I could have told her that nobody wins awards for outsourcing a mother. Instead, I nodded and signed whatever papers she held out. "You're being very mature about this, Mom," she said without looking up. That was the moment I almost lost it. Almost. Because if there's one thing about being mature, it's knowing when someone means you're being compliant. And if there's another thing about being 73 and underestimated, it's learning how to let them think they've won. The last day in the house arrived with birdsong and the smell of coffee. Sarah picked up from the drive-thru. She handed me a paper cup and told me it was just how I like it, despite the fact that she'd forgotten I take tea now, ever since caffeine started messing with my sleep. "Are you ready?" Connor asked. "Born ready," I said. Elise opened the front door and gestured toward the driveway. "The van's here." I stepped out with my suitcase. The garden was in bloom tulips just peeking from the soil. I made a note to call the new owners, whoever they'd be, and ask them not to pull up the lilies. Not that I would. I wouldn't call. I wouldn't even look back. But it helped pretending I still had a choice. Sarah's car was waiting. Sleek, silent. I sat in the passenger seat and buckled myself in. As we pulled out of the driveway, I watched the house, the one I'd raised them in, the one I nursed their fevers, in the one I sang lullabies inside shrink in the rearview mirror. Not one of them looked back, so I did it for them, one last glance. Then I faced forward. Because the thing about being discarded is that people forget one crucial fact. You can only be thrown away by those who never bothered to ask if you'd already built a parachute. The first thing I noticed when I walked into Sunny Ridge was the smell. Not the floral air freshener they'd probably sprayed 5 minutes before I arrived. No, that was already fading. I mean the real smell disinfectant canned peas and something vaguely like steamed plastic. The sort of scent that clings to linoleum and lives in the grout. "This is the community room," said Nancy. The facility administrator, who was either 35 or 55, it was hard to tell under the layers of exhaustion. She gestured toward a beige room filled with beige chairs and beige people nodding off in front of a beige television. I'm not saying it lacked personality, but if personality were soup, this place was boiled water. Sarah and Elise stood behind me nodding with forced cheer. "You'll have plenty of time to socialize," Elise said brightly. "They've got bridge bingo and a craft night." "Craft night," I repeated. "We already signed you up for next Thursday," Sarah added. "You're making sock snowmen." It was April. My room, sorry apartment, was a single box with one window that looked out onto the parking lot. From my bed, I could see the dumpster. It seemed symbolic. The staff were kind. I'll give them that. Stretched thin as overused metaphors, but kind. Nancy showed me the call button by the bed, the thermostat that only worked in Celsius for some reason, and the wall hooks meant for cheerful personal touches. "Make it your own," she said. I unpacked in silence. A single box of books, a couple framed photos, the miniature tea kettle Elise thought was adorable. I set my crocheted blanket on the twin bed and sat. The door shut behind them. I waited for the sound of their heels to disappear. Then the ignition of 3 vehicles. Then silence. I gave myself 10 minutes to cry. 10 minutes to mourn the end of a life I had built with calluses and casseroles. 10 minutes to feel every betrayal wash over me as if it were a second skin. And then I stopped, because crying hadn't changed anything in my 73 years. Why would it start now? Instead, I stood up, grabbed the notepad I kept in my purse, and wrote one word: begin. Over the next few days, I got the lay of the land. Breakfast at 7 a.m. Lunch at noon, dinner by 5:30 earlier if they ran out of meatloaf. Lights out was more a suggestion than a rule, but the hallway motion sensor lights made rebellion difficult. I met the residents. Margaret, who used to teach Latin and still muttered conjugations in her sleep. Harold, a what-you-fithi buff, who wore his medals on Tuesdays. Loretta, who'd once been on a game show and reminded you every time she forgot your name. But what struck me most wasn't the people. It was the waiting. Everyone here was waiting for something. A phone call, a visitor, the nurse with their meds, Sunday lunch, permission to matter again. "Have your kids visited yet?" Margaret asked during lunch on day 4. "Not since drop-off," I said. She chuckled like it was a punchline. "Mine came 6 months ago, said they were taking me out for ice cream. Still waiting." Harold raised his glass of watered-down juice. "To the children who care." We all clinked our glasses. It was the saddest toast I'd ever joined. At night, I would lie in bed and listen. Through the paper-thin walls, I could hear the ghosts of lives lived loudly now whispered into the ether. The soft sobs of someone who forgot where they were. The rattle of a wheelchair in the hall. A nurse apologizing for being late again. I kept thinking about my sister Catherine. 2 months before she died of a heart attack, she wrote me a letter. "Ellie," she'd said, "I've left you everything. You're the only person who ever saw me, not the scientist, not the spinster, not the woman who chose logic over romance. You," she ended it with, "do something that matters. Don't let them forget who you are. And for heaven's sake, don't let them forget who they are either." At the time, I thought she meant take a cruise, maybe start watercolor painting. Now I knew better. What she was really saying was make them remember. Show them your spine. Remind them you're not dead yet. One night, I sat in the tiny common room, pretending to read, and overheard 2 staff members whispering by the vending machine. "They're cutting another aid from Knights. You kidding? We're already short 3. Admin says budget's too tight. Budget. It always came down to that. Budget and power. And I had both. Because what no one here knew, not my children, not the staff, not even Nancy with her clipboard and polite head tilts, was that Catherine hadn't just left me everything. She left me $7 million. That's right. 7, with 6 zeros. And I had no intention of spending it on bingo cards and sock snowmen. No, I had a plan. And it started the next morning with a request to use the computer in the staff room. I just want to check my email, I told the nurse. She smiled. Of course, Mrs. Montgomery. Let me log you in. As soon as she left, I opened a search engine. I didn't type best revenge plan, but I might as well have. Sunny Ridge was owned by a company called Heartwell Living. They sounded warm, comforting, like someone in a cardigan might bake you muffins and discuss holistic aging. What I found was less cardigan, more hedge fund. Heartwell was a small holding company running 3 facilities across New England. Their latest blog post featured an elderly man in a rocking chair, staring serenely into a fake sunset, and a tagline that read, "Dignity and ease in every breath." Unfortunately, that dignity was underwritten by late loan payments and shaky management. I clicked through property records, IRS filings, and a few eyebrow-raising Yelp reviews. One mentioned being served fish sticks 4 times in a week. It became clear pretty quickly Heartwell was hemorrhaging money. They'd overextended during a recent expansion, took on too many liabilities, and were now scrambling to stay solvent. Their 3 properties, including Sunny Ridge, were quietly listed with a commercial real estate broker. The price not terrible. Definitely not $7 million terrible. I leaned back in the computer chair, the plastic creaking beneath me, and smiled. I could buy the place. Hell, I could buy all 3. It was the first time in weeks I felt like I was breathing air instead of resignation. Old age wisdom fact. Don't assume wrinkles mean weakness. Sometimes they're just battle lines from 100 quiet victories. The next morning, while Elise texted to ask if I liked the compression socks she ordered, I did not. I took the bus into town. It's a peculiar thrill, by the way, to sit among commuters on a weekday morning while harboring a $7 million secret. I arrived at Kendrick and Ross Attorneys at Law just before noon. The receptionist was younger than my Tupperware and offered me cucumber water with all the enthusiasm of someone trapped in the wrong major. "I'd like to speak with someone about a private acquisition," I said, smoothing my coat. "And I'd prefer to keep my name off the record." I was introduced to Mason Kendrick, early 40s. Kind eyes, the sort of man who probably makes pros and cons lists before choosing a toothbrush. "So, Ms. Montgomery," he began, "after reviewing the notes, you're interested in acquiring a senior living facility." 3, actually. He blinked. "And you'd like to remain anonymous during the transaction." "I'd prefer the purchase be made through a trust or corporate shell. Something quiet." Mason raised an eyebrow, impressed. "May I ask what your long-term goals are?" I smiled politely. "Let's just say I've recently acquired both capital and clarity." We spent nearly 2 hours outlining my options. Mason was smart. He didn't ask why a woman wearing orthopedic loafers and carrying a canvas tote bag had this kind of money. He just rolled with it. He also didn't flinch when I asked if we could fast-track the due diligence. Heartwell was teetering, and I didn't want to lose the opportunity. "You'll have to be strategic," he warned. "But yes, this is absolutely doable. We'll form a shell corporation, something generic like LMH Ventures. Your name won't appear on anything until you choose." "Perfect," I said, standing to leave. "Oh, and tell your team to draft a basic resident rights review. We'll be rewriting policy." Mason paused, then asked carefully, "Why not just move into a better facility?" I met his gaze. "Because that would only solve my problem. I want to solve the whole problem." Quirky fact of the day: the oldest existing nursing home in America opened in 1817 in Boston and was run entirely by women. I don't know what they were feeding people back then, probably cabbage and stoicism. But you can bet the visiting policy was stricter than mine was about to be. Back at Sunny Ridge, I returned to my usual routine bingo hallway, gossip, watery coffee. but now with a secret mission ticking behind my smile. Within 10 days, Kendrick called. "We're ready to move," he said. "They're biting. Harthwell is behind on payroll again and panicking. How soon? Sale could close in 3 weeks. All 3 properties. Let's do it." And just like that, I became the shadow buyer of Sunny Ridge River Pines and Maple Hollow. I still hadn't told my children. Not because I wanted to lie, because I wanted to wait. Academic debate phrase. One could argue that transparency is always the moral imperative, but withholding information in this case created the conditions for genuine accountability. What happened next felt like cosmic poetry. I implemented my first policy change as silent owner of Sunny Ridge. A memo, authored by Administrator Nancy, with my guidance, went out to all families. Effective immediately visiting hours will be restructured. Families who visit residents 2 or more times per week will continue to have full flexible access. Families visiting less than twice per week will be limited to Sundays 2 to 4 p.m. The letter was careful, legal, and entirely within our rights. By the following Tuesday, my phone rang. "Sarah, what the hell is this?" I looked at my nails. "You'll have to be more specific, dear. This letter? About restricting when we can visit you. Is this even legal?" I feigned concern. "Oh no. Have you been visiting less than twice a week?" There was silence on the other end. "It's targeting us," she finally said. "Is this some kind of punishment?" I didn't answer. Instead, I folded my note from Catherine back into my journal and murmured, "No, Sarah, it's a mirror. Because sometimes when people stop recognizing your worth, you don't have to scream to be heard. You just have to make them look at their own reflection." It took approximately 36 hours for my children to go from mild irritation to full-blown legal frenzy. Sarah showed up first, storming into Sunny Ridge on a Tuesday, like she owned the lease on the oxygen. She burst into my room, holding the letter, with the same expression she used to give Elise when someone had borrowed her clothes without asking. "Mum," she barked, not even bothering with a hello. "What is this?" I was knitting. Badly. I had decided to pick up the hobby again because, quite frankly, it made me look more harmless than I was. I peered over my glasses. "Afternoon, Sarah. Nice to see you." She didn't smile. "This new visiting policy," she snapped, waving the letter like it owed her money. "Did you know about it?" I gave her my signature shrug, the same one I used when someone told me the soup was too salty. "It came in the mail just like yours." She narrowed her eyes. "It says limited access for families who don't visit twice a week." "Yes, I remember. Very specific." Sarah folded her arms. "This is insane. You can't restrict when your own children see you. It's discriminatory." Old age wisdom fact. The fastest way to uncover someone's guilt is to give them a rule that only hurts if they've been slacking. Margaret, who was sitting in the chair across from me, crocheting a perfectly symmetrical pot holder, looked up and said, "You're one of her kids. She's lovely. Always asks if I've had dessert." Sarah blinked, caught off guard. Thank you." Harold shuffled by with his walker and added, "Wish my daughter got this upset about not visiting." I smiled. Academic debate phrase. It's worth considering whether limitations that highlight neglect constitute ethical motivators or punitive overreach. "Mom," Sarah hissed as she sat down. "This is about us, isn't it? You're mad we haven't visited enough. Have you visited enough?" She looked offended at the very idea of being questioned. "We're busy," she said. "I understand. You have jobs, families, priorities." "Yes. And I was one of them. Once." There was a silence between us that made the walls hum louder. Outside, the hallway TV was playing Family Feud at full volume. "Oh, the irony. Why didn't you just call me?" she asked. "Why didn't you say you were upset?" "Because saying it would have made me pitiful. This policy, it just made me visible." Her jaw tightened. "Did you file a complaint?" "Sarah, I don't even own a printer." Quirky fact of the day. In 2019, a woman in Japan pretended to be a different elderly person every month to access more social services until the staff recognized she used the same brand of lotion every time. Cleverness wears many disguises. She stayed 32 minutes, Long enough to interrogate, not long enough to connect. When she left, I returned to my knitting, a lopsided scarf that would never see daylight. Jessica showed up 2 days later, all apologies and floral print. She was the diplomat of the family, the soft one. She brought a card and a plant I'm fairly certain she'd picked up from the gas station on the way. "Mom," she said, perching on the edge of my bed like it might explode. "This letter has really upset everyone." I noticed. "We just want to know what's going on." "Are you okay?" I paused, setting the scarf aside. "Do you mean in general, or since being dropped off like a forgotten gym bag?" Jessica winced. "That's not fair, isn't it?" Her eyes filled with tears. Jessica cries like a faucet with poor water pressure, steady quiet, and eventually warping the floorboards. "I didn't know," she said. "I didn't know you were this lonely." "That's because you didn't ask." She wiped her cheek with the sleeve of her cardigan. "It's just, we thought we were doing the right thing." Old age wisdom fact. The right thing done for the wrong reason can still rot from the inside out. I softened just a little. "Jess, I said you all thought putting me here was an act of love, and maybe part of it was, but the bigger part, it was convenience dressed up in concern." She didn't argue, which I'll admit threw me off balance. Then she asked the question I'd been waiting for. Did you do this?" I raised an eyebrow. "Do what?" She held up the letter. "The policy. The restrictions. Did you make this happen?" I smiled, but didn't answer. Instead, I reached for my tea. "Families who love their parents don't have to worry about schedules," I said softly. She left soon after the plant forgotten on my bedside table. A day later, Michael appeared. No flowers, no apologies. Just Michael in his businessman jacket with his smartwatch and slight frown. "This is absurd," he said, not even sitting. "You're not some hostage in here. You could have told us if you had a problem." "I did," I said. "You just weren't listening." He ran a hand through his hair. "You can't just, Mom, this isn't how families fix things." "Then tell me," I said, "how do families fix things?" He hesitated. "By pretending everything's fine until someone dies." That stopped him. "What do you want from us?" he asked finally. "Guilt, time, money." I met his eyes. "I want you to want to be here. That's it. That's the thesis." I didn't want grand gestures or expensive consultants. I wanted them to remember that I am more than their shared responsibility. Michael said nothing. Then he left the door, clicking gently behind him. And I sat in my room, surrounded by the scent of gas station lilies and guilt-drenched air freshener, smiling to myself. Because here's the thing. If love doesn't show up on an ordinary Tuesday, it doesn't count when it arrives in a rush on Sunday at 1:59 p.m. When you own the place, Tuesdays hit different. Technically, no one at Sunny Ridge knew the ownership had changed hands. That was part of the deal I struck with Mason Kendrick, keep my name off everything until I decided otherwise. On paper, the facility had been sold to a company called LMH Ventures, which sounded corporate enough to slip past casual scrutiny. But now the staff were operating under a new directive, one I'd quietly introduced via Nancy, the ever-polite administrator, who still thought my biggest concern was whether the dining hall served jello or pudding. I told her I wanted to volunteer in the activities department. She looked surprised, but delighted, probably because most residents requested extra cable channels, not additional responsibilities. That Tuesday morning, I showed up with a clipboard and a list. "Good morning, team," I said to a room of mildly confused aides and 2 nurses on their second coffees. "Today we're going to talk about dignity, not just in mission statements, but in practice." They thought I was joking. I wasn't. Nancy stood beside me with a tense smile. She was under strict instructions from LMH Ventures to implement my suggestions without resistance. She didn't know why, but corporate money tends to hush questions. "We'll start by adjusting the staff rotation so that no aide works more than 3 double shifts a week," I announced. "Also, we're expanding family counseling availability to twice a month." One nurse blinked. "Wait, who approved this?" I smiled. "Ownership." The room went still for a second. Then Nancy coughed and changed the subject. By noon, the newsletter had gone out. By dinner, Harold was telling people I might be in cahoots with the top brass. Margaret just winked and said I walked like someone who didn't need permission anymore. She wasn't wrong. That evening, Sarah called again. She always called after visiting hours ended, as if waiting ensured she wouldn't feel obligated to show up in person. "Mom, there's a rumor you're involved with whoever bought Sunny Ridge." I stirred my tea. "Where'd you hear that?" "Elise says her friend's husband works in acquisitions. Something about a sudden trust purchase." Did you buy this place?" I sipped slowly. "Now, what would I do with a nursing home?" She didn't laugh. "Mom," I didn't answer. She pushed harder. "Why would you even want to own a place like this?" "Because I live here," I said simply, "and because no one else was going to fix it." There was a pause, the kind that signals your opponent just realized they're in check and hadn't seen it coming. "Are you serious?" she asked. "Very." Another pause. "Mom, this is huge. You could have told us." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the dark parking lot. "Would you have listened?" She didn't answer, but she didn't hang up either. "Listen," she finally said, her voice softer. "If this is true, then, wow. I didn't think you had it in you." "Sarah," I said gently, "that's the problem. None of you did." The next day, I was called into the conference room. Apparently, my children had requested a clarifying conversation. All three were waiting when I walked in, Sarah with a folder full of printed spreadsheets, Michael with a legal pad, and Jessica clutching a reusable water bottle like it might leak if she blinked wrong. "Hi, Mom," Jessica said, standing up to pull out a chair. I nodded, but I didn't sit. Not yet. Sarah stood too. "We've done some digging." "Digging," I repeated. "Into LMH Ventures. It's a shell corporation. The trust behind it traces back to you." Michael chimed in. "You bought Sunny Ridge." I let the silence stretch just long enough for discomfort to settle. "Yes," I said finally. "I bought it." Jessica gasped, like I'd announced I was joining the circus. "But why?" she asked. "Because I could. Because Catherine left me the means. And because being parked here like I was someone else's errand made me realize something. This place, these people, this life. It deserved more." Michael frowned. "So this was revenge." I shook my head. "This was justice, with a side of structure." They didn't speak. So I kept going. I watched aides sleep in their cars between shifts. I saw Harold go 3 weeks without a call. I've had instant mashed potatoes more times than should be legal. And no one asked how I was doing unless they were paid to. Sarah finally broke the silence. "You should have told us. You would have tried to stop me." "No, we wouldn't." I looked at her. She looked away. "I wanted you to feel what I felt I said. I wanted you to see how it feels when the people you love most decide you're better managed than heard." The air in the room thickened. Someone's phone buzzed. No one moved. "So what now?" Michael asked. "Now, I said you visit because you want to, not because you're allowed to. And if you don't want to," I shrugged, "I'll still be here, running the place, making sure no one else gets boxed up and forgotten." Sarah looked down at her folder. "You really bought all 3 properties?" I smiled. "You always said I wasn't business-minded. Turns out I just needed the right product accountability." I left them sitting in that beige room with their folders and questions, and everything they thought they knew about me, unraveling like a dropped ball of yarn. And I went back to my room in my building, and made myself a cup of tea. Because sometimes the best power move you can make is owning the very place they tried to put you in. The next week, something strange started happening at Sunny Ridge. People were smiling. Not the polite, glazed-over smiles you give when you don't want to seem rude. These were real, honest, wrinkle-creasing, tooth-showing smiles. Margaret started humming again in the hallways. Harold taught a group of younger aides how to shuffle cards like a Vegas pro. Loretta announced she'd be leading a weekly scandal rewatch club, and someone actually cheered. The cafeteria finally got that espresso machine I'd seen listed in the dusty budget ledger. The food improved, 2 less grey, more green. I hired a part-time chef from town, a single mother named Val, who somehow made vegetable stew taste like a secret. I began holding monthly town halls in the community room open to staff and residents. No clipboards, no scripts, just people talking, venting, suggesting, laughing. Word got out. First came the local reporter. She showed up after a tip from someone's niece and asked to interview the new owner. I declined the spotlight, asked Nancy to speak instead. She did beautifully. The piece ran under the headline, Second Chances at Sunny Ridge, How One Facility is Redefining Aging with Dignity. I clipped it and taped it inside my closet. Then came the families. Not just mine, others too. The ones who used to breeze in once a month with guilt fruit baskets and duty hugs. Suddenly they were around more, helping with bingo night, bringing grandkids to movie afternoons. One son built a raised herb garden in the courtyard so his mum could feel useful again. That one got to me, because that's the secret no one talks about in places like this. We don't just want safety, or warmth, or pudding that tastes like more than beige. We want to be useful. We want to matter. I received a letter a few days later. Handwritten, no return address. Dear LMH Ventures, my name is Maureen, and my mother lives at River Pines. I don't know who you are, but you've changed her life. She used to call me once a week to cry. Now she calls to tell me about a knitting group she started. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. Sincerely, someone who didn't know she could still be proud of her mom. I wept reading it, not out of sadness, out of recognition, because I'd been that mom, the one stripped of her narrative and reduced to someone else's checklist. And now, somehow, I was rewriting the story for others too. My children came around more. Not perfectly, but differently. Jessica showed up one morning with a picnic basket. No reason, she said, which I knew meant every reason. We sat under the newly planted lilac tree near the fence. She unpacked cold pasta salad lemonade and an old scrapbook we hadn't opened in 20 years. Remember this? She asked, pointing at a photo of me in a floppy sun hat, dragging 3 kids through a field of tulips. You were crying, I said. Sarah had a bee in her sock. Michael stepped in mud, and you had your pants on backwards. She laughed, really laughed. God, we were awful. No, I said. You were kids, and I loved every second of it. She got quiet, then asked, why didn't you just tell us what you were going through? Because I did, I said softly. You just weren't listening loud enough. Jessica nodded. Do you hate us for it? She asked. No, I said. But I needed you to feel the absence, to know what it's like when love becomes an appointment. Michael stopped by the next weekend with 2 books under his arm. Thought we could trade, he said. Like a little library between us. I raised an eyebrow. Since when do you read fiction? Since I realized your life was more interesting than mine. We played chess. He lost, twice. He told me he and his wife were taking a break. I didn't say anything. Just refilled his tea and waited. Sometimes healing doesn't require words, just presence. Sarah came last. Late one evening, after the halls had gone quiet, and the TV in the lounge was playing reruns of The Golden Girls, she knocked. I opened the door and saw her standing there holding a letter. A real one, envelope, stamp, hand-addressed. I was going to mail this, she said, but I figured, better to just read it. I stepped aside. She sat on the edge of the bed, unfolded the paper, and began, Dear Mom, you scared me. Not because you bought the building, not because you made us look bad, but because you reminded me that you're still so much more than what I wanted you to be. I spent years thinking I had you all figured out. The loving, dependable, low-maintenance mom. But I forgot that before you were our mother, you were your own person. You still are. I'm sorry I stopped seeing that. I want to learn again, if you'll let me. Love, Sarah. I didn't speak for a long time, just took her hand and held it. And that was enough. Old age wisdom fact. You don't always get justice in the courtroom. Sometimes you get it in the break room, or in the cafeteria, or under a lilac tree eating pasta salad with someone who finally remembered who you used to be. I wasn't done yet. There was still more to build, more to heal. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I wasn't building it alone. And for a woman who'd once been handed a brochure and told to smile, that felt like a revolution. The notice came quietly tucked inside an envelope marked Administrative Memo, just a standard update to Sunny Ridge residents. Effective next quarter, the facility will undergo a scheduled renovation of the common spaces courtyard and resident rooms. Feedback and suggestions welcome. I laughed out loud when I read it, because behind the careful wording, the reality was this: I was tearing the place down, not the walls necessarily, but the story. The assumption that retirement homes are places where life goes to fade. I wasn't going to let that narrative stand. We started with the courtyard. For years, it had been a sad patch of crabgrass and a rusted bench with one broken slat. Now raised garden beds, string lights, native plants, a small koi pond. The residents took turns tending the vegetables. Margaret ruled over the tomatoes like a queen guarding her rubies. I also funded a tiny library nook with donated books, and a local high school's shop class built us custom wooden shelves as part of their final project. The changes rippled. Loretta suggested a speaker series. Harold proposed chess tournaments. A volunteer from the college nearby started teaching watercolor workshops. People came back to life. The thing about joy in old age is that it's a quiet miracle. It doesn't arrive with confetti. It shows up in small moments: a well-sliced apple, the warmth of sun through a window, a nurse remembering how you take your tea. And that was the difference now the staff remembered. Because they weren't just punching a clock anymore, they were seen, heard, respected. I gave everyone raises, yes, even the part-timers, and instituted a policy that any employee could take 2 paid hours a week to sit and talk with a resident, no task attached. I called it the listening hour. We paid for time to slow down. Funny thing happens when people feel they have time again, they start to care. One afternoon, as spring finally chased away the grey, a bus pulled up. Out stepped a group of visitors from Maple Hollow, one of the 2 other homes I'd purchased. They'd heard the rumours, the stories, the newspaper piece. They wanted to see what we were doing at Sunny Ridge. We gave them a tour. Margaret led the library portion. Harold taught one man how to shuffle cards on the patio. I sat with a woman named Dot, who told me with tears in her eyes that she hadn't been hugged since Christmas. I hugged her twice. When they left, I made a decision I wasn't going to stay hidden anymore. That night, I told Nancy the truth. She didn't blink. Just smiled like she'd known all along. Is that why you always asked about the copier budget? Yes. And why the supplier invoices started arriving in your name? Yes. She laughed. Well, thank God. I thought I was losing it. I told her she was the best administrator I'd ever met. She cried. A week later, I stood in front of the residents and staff, everyone gathered in the courtyard, and I told them everything. That I owned the place. That Catherine left me a fortune. That I used it to rewrite the rules. That they weren't just recipients of care, they were part of something. Nobody gasped. Nobody walked out. Instead, they applauded. Then Harold shouted drinks on the house, and the kitchen brought out lemonade and ginger cookies. It was probably the greatest moment of my life. And I say that as someone who once successfully parked a station wagon during a tornado warning. Shh, my children, they've changed. Not overnight, but meaningfully. Jessica now volunteers at Sunny Ridge once a week, running music therapy sessions. Sarah helped organize a fundraiser for the garden expansion. Michael, well, he shows up. And he listens now. That alone is a miracle. One evening, we were all together at the home for movie night. Blankets, popcorn, folding chairs. The sound of music played on a screen someone donated. Sarah leaned over halfway through and whispered, "I think Dad would have been proud." I nodded but said nothing, because I wasn't doing this for him. I was doing it for me, for every woman who ever raised a family and was thanked with silence, for every mother whose birthday was remembered with a text instead of a visit, for every person who was ever made to feel like an afterthought in the story they helped build. I did it for us. And I'm not done, because aging isn't the end of the story. Sometimes it's where the plot finally starts to make sense. 3 months after I revealed myself as the owner, I was invited to speak at the City Council's Senior Wellness Summit. I almost declined. The idea of standing behind a microphone under fluorescent lights, while a panel of well-meaning bureaucrats nodded solemnly, didn't exactly thrill me. But Nancy encouraged me, said people needed to hear it from me, not just in whispers or second-hand articles. So I said yes. They gave me 10 minutes. I used 5. I stood at that podium, wearing the same pale blue blouse I wore when Sarah graduated college. My hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, but from 80 years of living. And I said this: we are not leftovers. We are not burdens. We are not punchlines or warm-up acts or side stories. We are still becoming. You talk about elder care like it's a cost. I'm here to tell you it's an investment. Because when you give people dignity, they give it back. When you listen to them, they grow louder in the best way. You want stronger communities. Start by remembering who built them. They gave me a standing ovation. A few people cried. I left before lunch was served, ducking out the side door and walking into the sunlight, like I hadn't just lit the match that might change everything. Oh! The next week, a non-profit from out of state called. They'd read the article, watched the summit, and wanted to replicate the Sunny Ridge model. They offered me a consulting contract. I said yes. Not because I needed the money, but because I liked the idea of turning my revenge into a blueprint. A few weeks later, a woman named Diane arrived. She was 59, a retired social worker sent to shadow me for 2 days. She followed me as I checked in on residents, greeted staff, edited the newsletter, and reviewed contractor bids for the new physical therapy wing. At lunch, she looked at me across her tray of lentil soup and said, "You do realize you're kind of a legend, right?" I almost choked on my tea. "I'm an old lady who bought a building," I said. "That's hardly mythic." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You're the woman who told the world to stop underestimating you. That makes you dangerous in the best way." Later that night, I walked the halls alone. It was quiet, peaceful. I passed Harold's room. He was snoring with the TV still on. Loretta's door was cracked, soft jazz drifting out. A new resident named Tina had crocheted a doorknob cover shaped like a sunflower. The whole floor felt alive. I stopped at the end of the hallway where a mirror hung, and I looked at myself. Not just my reflection, my story. Lines deepened, hair silver body softer in some places, stronger in others. But eyes still sharp, still burning. I whispered, "You did it." Not because it was over, but because the woman in the mirror deserved to hear it. Catherine had once told me to do something that mattered. I didn't just do something. I became someone. Not just a mom. Not just a widow. Not just another old woman in a beige room. I was Eleanor Montgomery. Owner? Architect. Rebel with a checkbook and a clipboard. And I wasn't done. I still had Maple Hollow and River Pines to transform. I still had grant proposals to review nurses, to hire lives to unforget. Because that's what this really was. Not a business. Not a protest. A rescue. A quiet, determined rescue of every soul who had been shelved too soon. And if they didn't write that in the history books, didn't matter. Because we wrote it on the walls of this place. In paint, in laughter, in the names of garden vegetables. In every bite of soup that didn't taste like sorrow. And maybe, just maybe, in the way our children would now think twice before deciding who their parents were allowed to be. The first email came from a woman named Candace in Boise. She wrote, "Dear Ms. Montgomery, I'm 62. My daughter recently suggested we start planning for the future and handed me a brochure for a place that looks like a dentist's office with curtains. I found your story online and cried. Not because it was sad, because it was true. Thank you for reminding me that I'm not done yet. Candace." After Candace, there were dozens, then hundreds. Emails, handwritten letters, comments on the local newspaper's website. Messages from Maine to California. Some from caregivers. Some from seniors. Some from children of seniors who suddenly saw their parents differently. People weren't just moved, they were changed. It was like I'd cracked open a dam no one realized had been holding back real lives, real regret, real potential. And just like that, the revolution had a mailing list. One Saturday, I was planting thyme in the courtyard garden when Nancy walked up, holding her phone eyebrows high. "You've got a voicemail," she said. "From the governor's office." I dusted off my hands and stared. "The governor." She nodded. "Apparently, someone forwarded him the summit speech. They're asking if you'd be open to joining a state advisory board on aging policy." I laughed so hard I scared a squirrel out of the basil planter. Me, Eleanor Montgomery. The woman who once got a parking ticket for overstaying at the post office because she was debating between two kinds of stamps. And now I was being asked to shape state policy. I said yes, not because I thought I was qualified, but because I finally realized qualified is a moving target. Especially for women like me, women who were taught to apologize before speaking. Not anymore. I started traveling occasionally. Not far. Just short trips to nearby towns where I gave talks at retirement communities, hospitals, non-profits. I told them what I'd learned, that aging is not a disease, that homes should be filled with people, not cases, that love doesn't expire just because mobility does. Some places took notes. Some asked how they could do the same. Others just listened, and that was enough. Every time I returned to Sunny Ridge, I was greeted like family. Residents clapped aids, gave me updates. Staff asked for more time to talk about phase 2 of the renovations. We were growing. Not just the building, the spirit. And that's what no one prepares you for when you get old. Not the loneliness, not the pain, the smallness. How you slowly get resized into someone who's supposed to shrink into the background. But I wasn't shrinking. I was expanding. My children, they were evolving too. Sarah, once my harshest critic, now called every Wednesday. She started writing short essays about aging and sent them to local papers. She even admitted she was in therapy. "I'm working on my stuff," she said one evening. Turns out I was angry about a lot more than just your policy memo. I smiled. "Self-awareness looks good on you." Jessica officially joined the advisory board as a support liaison. She brought baked goods to every meeting and reminded people not to talk over the residents. Michael still visited quietly. Less ego now, more questions. He asked me how to handle conflicts at work, how to be more present with his daughter. He even brought her once, little Gracie. She made a card with glitter glue that said, "Dear Grandma, thank you for making the old people happy." I framed it. By late fall, the koi pond had new fish the garden had turned golden, and Harold had gotten so good at shuffling cards that the local news did a segment on him called Ace of Ages. Margaret's potholders were being sold at the Sunday market. Loretta's Scandal Rewatch Club had a wait list. I stood under the pergola, one crisp morning hands in my cardigan pockets, watching 3 aides sit with a resident named Edna as she recited a poem she'd written. 79 years old, nearly blind, and still creating. That's the point. We weren't being taken care of. We were thriving, and for once that word wasn't just brochure fluff. It was real, it was happening. And it was just the beginning. Winter came softly to Sunny Ridge. The first snow arrived overnight, blanketing the courtyard in a sheet of silence. By morning, the koi pond was frozen, the garden beds tucked beneath quilts of frost. Everything looked still, except us. Inside the halls were humming. We had decorated early this year. Not because of any holiday pressure, but because someone suggested it, and everyone agreed. Garland wound around banisters, paper snowflakes taped to windows. Handmade ornaments from both residents and staff dangled on a small pine tree in the lobby. Harold insisted we top it with a bingo ball labeled G73. I didn't argue. We also introduced Winter Wishes, a simple idea each resident wrote down one thing they wanted before the year ended. Not gifts, not trips, just something meaningful. The responses were everything. Sing Silent Night with my granddaughter. Hold a puppy. Eat my mother's gingerbread recipe one more time. Some were easy, some took planning. One woman wanted to watch the northern lights, so we borrowed a planetarium projector and turned the common room ceiling into stars. But one response stopped me. Margaret, our tomato queen, had written, "I want to feel useful until the end." I read it 3 times. Then I went to her room. "Margaret," I said gently, "you are useful." She looked at me with those sharp eyes of hers. "Then let me do more. Don't protect me from meaning." So I didn't. She became our new activities coordinator. She now organizes the monthly calendar hosts' baking hours and recently started a letter writing campaign to soldiers overseas. The staff adore her. She's fiercer than half of them and twice as organized. She told me later over lukewarm tea. "This place saved me, but you reminded me I was worth saving." Oh, around the same time, I got a letter from the last person I ever expected, Catherine's son. He had been estranged from her when she passed distant for years, but apparently someone sent him the article from the newspaper. He read about how I used her inheritance to build something instead of hiding. The letter was simple, handwritten, no return address. "Eleanor, my mother would have been proud. She always said you were fire under a calm surface. I see it now. Thank you for turning what she left behind into something she would have loved. J." I read it 4 times, then pressed it between the pages of Catherine's old gardening book. I think that's when I realized I had truly made peace. Not just with my children, not just with my past, but with the version of me I once thought was finished. New Year's Eve at Sunny Ridge was a marvel. Jessica strung fairy lights across the dining hall. Loretta DJ'd a playlist that was mostly Frank Sinatra and just a little bit ABBA. We served sparkling cider in champagne flutes, and everyone dressed up. Margaret wore pearls, Harold wore a tuxedo t-shirt, and I wore red lipstick for the first time in years. At midnight, we counted down all of us together. 3, 2, 1. And when the room erupted in cheers and applause, I looked around and realized this was family, not just the kind born from blood, the kind forged in shared time, effort, dignity, and laughter. We didn't start the new year alone. We started it seen. After the toast, I stepped outside. The snow was falling again, light and slow, like a song you didn't want to end. I stood there, letting it touch my hair, my face, my shoulders. And I thought, you were right, Catherine. Doing something that matters changes everything. I had no resolutions, just one quiet promise to myself. Keep going. Because the truth is, at 74, I finally understood what freedom really meant. It wasn't travel or wealth or approval. It was owning your place in the world and refusing to be written out of it. The first real storm of the year came in February. Ice sheathed the roads. Power flickered. The kind of cold that crept in sideways through vents and under doors, looking for soft places to settle. But Sunny Ridge held strong. Backup generators roared to life without delay. Staff stayed overnight, voluntarily slept on cots, took shifts, made pancakes in the middle of the night, just to keep the mood light. I walked the halls with a flashlight and a thermos of tea, stopping in rooms to check on residents, many of whom had fallen asleep early, trusting that for once they would be okay. The next morning, as the sun cracked the ice and the landscape sparkled like a field of diamonds, I stood in the lobby and thought, this is what safety looks like. Not a locked door, not silence, not sedation, but warmth, familiar faces, a community that shows up before the crisis. And I'll be honest, that day I allowed myself to hope that this little experiment of mine, this rebellion wrapped in care and policies and raised garden beds, wasn't just a blip. It was becoming the blueprint. In March, I visited River Pines, the second facility I bought after Sunny Ridge. It had once felt like a warehouse, long beige corridors, flickering lights, the smell of reheated food and resignation. Now it was starting to bloom. We'd installed skylights, painted murals on the walls, each hallway themed after a season. Staff were no longer quitting every month. Volunteers had doubled. A woman named Teresa approached me after lunch. "I've lived here 7 years," she said. "I was invisible for 6 of them." I took her hand. "You're not invisible anymore." She nodded. "I know. You made us feel like people again." It still broke me hearing that, because for so long I'd accepted it too, that aging meant erasure. But now I had proof all we ever needed was to be seen on purpose. April brought an invitation. National Conference on Elder Care, Washington, D.C. Keynote speaker me. I nearly laughed it off. But Nancy said, "Why not? You've been changing the world from a rocking chair. Might as well upgrade to a podium." So I went. I stood before a ballroom of suits and scarves and hopeful eyes. And I told them, "You don't need more policies. You need more presence. You don't need another task force. You need to sit next to someone with a walker and ask them how their day really was. You don't need innovation. You need restoration of dignity, purpose, and connection." They clapped. They asked questions. One woman hugged me and whispered I didn't know we were allowed to say these things. Allowed. That word stuck with me. How much of our silence, our decay, comes from simply believing we're not allowed to matter anymore? So I came back home and printed a new sign for the lobby wall at Sunny Ridge. Big, bold letters. You are still allowed to speak, to cry, to want, to change, to begin again. Thus, in May, Michael called me from the sidewalk in front of Sunny Ridge. "I'm here," he said, "but I don't want to come in with an agenda." I opened the door myself. We sat outside under the blooming wisteria side by side on the garden bench. He didn't say much, just watched the koi fish, sipped his coffee, then asked, "Do you think you'll ever slow down?" I smiled. "Michael," I said, "I didn't build all this just to sit still in it." He nodded, "Just checking." And that was it. That's the kind of peace that doesn't announce itself. It just settles. On my birthday in June, the staff threw a party. There were cupcakes, Polaroid photos strung on twine paper crowns, and a video montage they secretly put together with help from my children. It showed clips from news interviews, candid moments in the garden, me dancing during karaoke night, to an off-key rendition of Dancing Queen. At the end, the screen went dark, and a quote appeared. She wasn't just the owner. She was the proof that we were never too late to live. I cried. Not from sadness, from completion. Because for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was waiting to be loved, needed, or remembered. I already was. Summer at Sunny Ridge felt like something out of a dream. Children played in the courtyard on weekends. Staff brought their families now, not out of obligation, but because the place felt like a second home. Residents cheered them on from shaded benches, offering cookies and unsolicited life advice. Someone strung a hammock between two trees. Margaret organized a lemonade stand just for the novelty of it. We had become something rare, a place where generations mixed not through duty, but desire. And I began to realize I had built more than a home. I had built a circle where no one was in the center, where no one was at the edge, where everyone had a place to belong. One afternoon, I was invited to speak at a high school civics class. A student named Lila raised her hand and asked, "Do you think people our age can really make a difference?" I looked at her and said, "Change doesn't have a retirement age, but it doesn't have a minimum age either." They listened, not just politely, but fully. Afterward, a boy with a skateboard walked up and said, "My grandma's in a home. I didn't visit much. I will now." That night, I sat in bed, holding the visitor log from that day. 6 new names, all under the age of 25. And I thought maybe we are rewriting more than our own story. Maybe we're planting seeds in places we'll never see grow, but they'll bloom anyway. In August, I got an email from a non-profit in Norway. Apparently, a nursing student there had translated one of my speeches into Norwegian, and it had gone viral. They wanted permission to use Sunny Ridge as a model for a European pilot program. I laughed, sitting at my desk in my modest room, feet in slippers, hair still wet from a shower. Who would have thought that the woman once escorted to a folding chair in her daughter's wedding could now influence care policies across continents? I replied, "Yes, and please tell her thank you for believing in the possible." By September, the leaves began to fall again. We hosted a harvest dinner in the courtyard. Long wooden tables, strings of lights, soft jazz, warm soup, roasted vegetables from our own raised beds. Sarah gave a toast. To my mother, she said, raising her glass, who taught me that reinvention isn't just for the young, it's for the brave. My throat tightened. Jessica added, and for reminding us that being cared for doesn't mean being put away. Even Michael spoke. She changed a building, he said. But more importantly, she changed us. The clink of glasses that followed was soft, reverent, like applause wrapped in warmth. Later that night, I stayed behind after everyone went to bed. I sat alone in the courtyard under a sky full of stars. The air was cool. My cardigan hugged my shoulders. A distant wind chime played something that felt like memory. And I whispered, "Thank you, Catherine," because she was the start of this. Her letter, her faith, her refusal to let me fade. I don't know if she ever dreamed I would go this far. But I do know this. Grief is a seed. You can bury it in sorrow, or water it with purpose. I chose the latter. I checked the clock, 12:17 a.m. A new day. I stood, stretched my back, and walked slowly down the garden path, past the koi pond, past the mural wall where kids had painted flowers, past the bench, where I had first realized I didn't have to accept the script I was handed. And just before I opened the door to go inside, I looked up at the stars again. I thought, we are not done. Not yet. We are just beginning. October came with crisp mornings and the smell of cinnamon in the halls. Sunny Ridge was preparing for its first ever intergenerational fall festival, a wild idea Margaret had suggested while peeling apples. "Let's invite the community," she said. "Not just for the residents, for everyone. Kids, parents, students. Make it messy. Make it real." We did. Pumpkin carving, face painting, storytelling circles, even a tiny petting zoo rented from a local farm. One of the aides dressed as a scarecrow. Loretta ran the pie contest like it was the Olympics. And me, I sat beneath a maple tree and read aloud letters we'd received from around the world. One said, "I used to be afraid of aging. Now I'm just afraid I won't do it as beautifully as you have." Natalie, age 27, Toronto. People clapped after every letter. Not because of me, but because they saw themselves in the words. Young people, old people, somewhere in between people. We were all just trying to be seen, weren't we? That afternoon, a little girl handed me a drawing. It was a crayon sketch of Sunny Ridge, with flowers blooming out the windows. She'd written in careful block letters, "This is a happy place for old people and new people." I hung it in the hallway, because yes, that was exactly it. In early November, I got a call from the woman who now ran Maple Hollow Clara, a former hospice nurse with a sharp wit and a steel backbone. "Eleanor," she said, "one of our residents asked to meet you. He says he knew your sister." That name, Catherine, rose like a tide in my chest. I drove down the next morning. He was waiting in a plaid armchair, wool blanket over his knees, eyes cloudy but warm. "Name's George," he said, reaching for my hand. Catherine and I went to school together. We were sweet on each other once, until she met a tall fellow with a motorcycle and a laugh that made you feel like summer. I smiled. That would have been her husband. He nodded. "She was the best of us, you know." "I know." We sat in silence a moment. Then he leaned closer. "She'd be proud of you." And I believed him, because sometimes the world sends you back pieces of people you thought you'd lost, just to say you're not walking this alone. Back at Sunny Ridge, I began writing more. A memoir of sorts. Not for fame, for legacy. The working title. The year I remembered myself. Nancy helped me format it. Jessica proofread chapters. Harold contributed a foreword. She beat the odds with a checkbook and some basil. What more could you ask for? I included stories, letters, even staff recipes. The first printing sold out locally in a week. We donated proceeds to a scholarship fund for future caregivers, because that's what it's about in the end, not just surviving our years, but seeding something for those who follow. On Thanksgiving, all 3 of my children showed up early. Jessica brought candles and sweet potato casserole. Sarah brought her laptop. "Just a few work things, Mom, I promise." Michael brought flowers, and his daughter Gracie carried a paper crown. Today she announced Grandma is the Queen of Gratitude. I wore it proudly. That evening, as everyone gathered for dinner, residents, staff, families, I looked around and realized something I hadn't dared to name before. I was no longer the woman who was left behind. I was the woman who had built something no one could ever take away. Not because it was big, but because it was true. This place, these people, this life I chose after the first one was folded and packed away. Somehow, without intending to, I had become more than just someone's mother. I had become myself again. And even more than that, I had become a beginning for others. The first snow of December came quietly. It dusted the windowsills, softened the roof lines, and turned the courtyard into a watercolor. I watched it from the reading nook near the fireplace, a mug of tea in my hands, a blanket over my lap, and peace, real earned peace, settled in my chest, like a final puzzle piece finding its place. I was 75 now. Strange how a number can feel both enormous and like a whisper. Someone once said aging is just youth with more context. I believe that. Because I was finally living in full color. No more shrinking to fit a frame someone else built. No more waiting for permission. No more asking to be seen. Now people came to me. They asked how to make spaces like Sunny Ridge, how to build communities like this, how to carry the dignity of the old into the arms of the young. I gave them my favorite answer. You start by asking better questions. What do you need? What do you miss? What do you still dream of? And then you listen. The week before Christmas, my children surprised me with something I never expected. A plaque, hand-carved, simple, nailed gently above the entrance to the main building. It read, "The Eleanor Montgomery Home for Living Well." Not surviving, not fading, living well. I cried when I saw it. Ugly, grateful tears. Sarah handed me a tissue. You gave us our mother back. Jessica said, you gave us something to grow into. Michael just wrapped an arm around me and said, you were always the strongest one. And I believed them, because I knew it now, not out of ego, out of experience. Later that night, I walked the halls one last time before bed. The tree in the lobby twinkled quietly. Aide voices murmured behind the nurse's desk. Laughter echoed from the rec room. Margaret teaching someone how to knit, probably with sass, and threats of whacking them with a needle if they dropped a stitch. The koi pond was frozen, but beneath the ice life waited, quiet, slow, certain. I stopped at the mural in the hallway, a painted tree stretching the whole length of the wall. Its branches full of names, handprints, poems, tiny framed photos. Loretta had started it calling it the living timeline. I added mine that night. A small photo of me in the courtyard, hair wild in the wind cardigan askew, grinning like someone who had just remembered something important. Below it I wrote, not too late, never too small, always enough. I returned to my room, sat at my desk, opened my notebook, and I wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page. What's next? Because even now, even after all this, I wasn't finished. There were still stories to tell, still systems to challenge, still women sitting in quiet rooms, wondering if their time had passed. I wanted to find them, shake their shoulders gently, and whisper, you're not done yet. You are not forgotten. You are the story. So if you're hearing this, wherever you are, however old you are, know this. There is a version of your life you haven't met yet. She's strong, she's honest, she's unafraid, and she's waiting for you. Step into her. The world may not applaud at first, but you'll know. And that's more than enough.